The year was 1876, and summer had settled over the Wyoming territory like a heavy, dusty blanket. The air itself seemed brittle, waiting for a spark. It was a time of unsettled land, just enough after the great gold rushes and just far enough from the new railroad lines that hope still tasted like grit, and the law was less a fixed entity than a fragile truce. Dry Creek was the kind of town that seemed built primarily out of wind and brown lumber. Its single main street was a perpetual cloud of red dust, kicked up by every wagon wheel and every passing cowhand. Above it, the sky was an immense, daunting blue, the kind that reminded a person just how small they were. But the real life lay outside the town limits, scattered across the plains in the form of struggling cattle ranches. Here, authority often hinged on the sheriff's shaky stick or, more reliably, the heft and caliber of the strongest man's sidearm. Onto this particular stretch of dust rolled a stagecoach, its leather springs groaning a weary song. Inside sat Eleanor Wynne, though she introduced herself to the few people she spoke to as Eleanor Vance. At 25 years old, she carried the quiet, focused exhaustion of someone who had traveled too far and slept too little. Yet her posture suggested a practiced resilience. Eleanor was a wandering cook, a master of the campfire and the Dutch oven. She knew the alchemy of sourdough better than any minister knew his Bible, understanding precisely how much grit and patience went into coaxing flavor from scarce ingredients. Her eyes, the color of rich loam after a rain, were particularly expressive, capable of conveying a long story without ever uttering a syllable. They were her most honest feature, framed by the dust that never seemed to leave her lashes. She kept her left wrist habitually covered, even in the heat, beneath the cuff of a faded blue dress shirt she wore over her clothes. Beneath that cuff was a thin, pale scar, a remnant not of accident but of metal, a ghost mark left by a set of shackles long gone. Eleanor's immediate goal was simple and sharp-edged: secure a long season of work as a ranch cook. Earn enough cash, coin by precious coin, to finally open her own small, respectable eatery somewhere far from Wyoming. But her deeper, more essential need was less tangible. It was the desire for a place to truly belong, a corner of the world where she could put down roots without fear of them being instantly torn up. For the past 3 years, she had been defined by what she was running from, and she longed to be defined by what she was building. The man who was meant to hire her was waiting near the livery. Elias Eli McCord, at 32, owned the 200 acres of Sweetwater Ranch. He was a man built to hold a saddle and ride long hours, his face weathered not just by sun, but by the kind of guarded silence common among Western cavalry veterans. His war scars were less visible than Eleanor's, residing in the deep lines around his eyes and the economy of his movements. Eli spoke only when necessary, but when he did, his voice carried the authority of a man who knew the true cost of words. Eli's needs were immediate and desperate. The summer was approaching its brutal peak, and the yearly cattle drive was looming. He required a cook, yes, but more so, a steward, someone who could manage the provisions and the morale of a rough, hungry crew of cowhands. The last cook had run off 3 weeks prior after a disagreement involving a skillet and a lack of proper coffee grounds, leaving the Sweetwater kitchen a monument to chaos and burnt grease. The troubles facing Eli were not just the typical hardships of the dry season. The entire fate of Dry Creek was being quietly manipulated by Bartholomew Pike, the enormous rancher who also controlled the only slaughterhouse in the region. Pike, in cahoots with the town's sheriff, a shifty, ambitious man named Voss, aimed to corner the water supply. Sweetwater Ranch, with its modest but reliable stream access, was their next target. Pike wanted the water, Voss wanted the payoff. Eli stood in the way of a powerful monopoly, and he knew his battle was not just against the drought, but against corrupt men. Eleanor's arrival, under a borrowed name, was thus a twist of fate loaded with unforeseen danger. She was using the alias Eleanor Vance to throw off anyone tracking her from Denver. There, a deputy police officer, A powerful man who had taken a sinister interest in her, had tried to coerce her into marriage. When she refused, he retaliated, framing her for a spectacular warehouse fire, a disaster she had merely witnessed, not caused. She had escaped the city jail, the ghost of the handcuffs still visible on her wrist. She was a woman running from a false charge of arson, seeking safety in the wide anonymity of the plains. The stagecoach lurched to a halt, drowning the main street in a fresh wave of red dust. Eli McCord was standing slightly apart, his arms crossed over a dark canvas jacket, watching the proceedings with the detached assessment of a man used to spotting trouble before it crested the horizon. Beside him, fidgeting with a frayed rope, was Jesse Boone, a young, loyal ranch hand whose earnestness Eli relied on. The moment the coach door opened, before Eleanor could even manage a clean dismount, a small disaster unfolded. Jesse's younger brother, William, a tow-headed boy of perhaps 7 who had been scrambling among the luggage, tripped over a loose plank of wood and tumbled into the dirt, letting out a sharp, choked cry. Jesse rushed forward, his own face contorted with clumsy panic, but Eleanor, still halfway out the coach, reacted with the cool precision of someone who had dealt with small crises in crowded spaces 1,000 times. She did not rush. Instead, she knelt instantly in the dust, her voice low and surprisingly steady, cut through the boy's distress. "Hold still, little man. Do not move the hurt part yet." She gently guided William's hand away from his scraped knee, her touch firm but devoid of alarm. She used the hem of her simple cotton skirt to wipe the blood and grit away, then produced a clean, pressed handkerchief from her sleeve, a curious piece of elegance on a dusty trail cook, and tied it tightly around the scrape. "There," she said, her voice now softer, a little lilt of dry humor in it. "We are all a little better for having a little dust rubbed off us. Are we not? You are safe. You held on to the ground, and that is a brave thing to do." William, still sniffling, looked up at her, silenced by her directness and her calm. He nodded, then gingerly stood up. Eli McCord watched the entire exchange, missing nothing. He saw the steady, competent hands, the lack of sentimental fuss, the immediate, quiet command she exerted over the child's fear. It was not the reaction of a typical city woman or a nervous traveler. It was the reaction of a person who knew how to handle a situation that was quickly going wrong, a person used to being the calm center of a chaotic environment. He assessed her quickly clean. Despite the travel, direct gaze, and the posture suggested a spine made of something more durable than just bone. When Eleanor finally stood, meeting Eli's intense, unblinking scrutiny, she did not offer an explanation or an apology for her momentary distraction. She simply stated her business. "You are Mr. McCord, I assume. I am Eleanor Vance. I am here for the cook's position." Eli simply nodded once, his assessment already complete. The Sweetwater Ranch kitchen was, as advertised, a disaster. The iron stove was coated in 3 kinds of grease. The wood box was nearly empty, and the air held the stale, depressing aroma of old coffee and forgotten purpose. A group of 7 cowhands, rougher and louder than the stagecoach crew, were lounging in the main bunkhouse, trading crude jokes and complaining about the latest culinary atrocity served up by a temporary replacement. "Well, looky here," drawled a towering, red-haired cowhand known as Three Beans, eyeing Eleanor's small, neat figure. "Is the boss bringing us an angel or a parlor doll to weep over the burnt beans?" The rest of the men chuckled, their humor coarse and immediate. Eli stepped forward, cutting the laughter short with his presence. "Vance is here to try her hand. 30 days trial. You show her respect. She is in charge of the food." Eleanor ignored the laughter. She did not raise her voice, but she moved like a whirlwind of focused energy. She demanded clean water, found the hidden cache of dry kindling, and within 10 minutes, the rusty stovepipe was puffing a thin column of smoke, and the deep, comforting thwack of wood being chopped correctly echoed outside. She did not attempt to impress them with fancy food. She worked with what she had dried pinto beans, a massive jar of potent sourdough starter she had carried in her own trunk, and coarse ground coffee. The kitchen, still chaotic, began to emit something truly intoxicating, the smell of order and purpose. For dinner, she served the simplest possible meal. Stewed beans simmered with a hint of salt pork and molasses, thick slices of sourdough bread baked directly on the stovetop, and coffee so black and strong it could stand a spoon up. She served the meal silently, not waiting for thanks. She watched the crew as they filed past, their initial mockery dissolving into simple, ravenous hunger. When the first 6 men took a bite, the collective sound of the Sweetwater bunkhouse went from a loud, rambling din to a sudden, profound silence. It was the silence of men whose bodies had remembered what truly good, sustaining food tasted like. Three Beans took his first bite of the sourdough, his eyebrows inching up his forehead. He looked at Eli, then back at Eleanor, then just kept chewing. The beans were not overcooked. The coffee was not muddy. It was simple, sincere, and satisfying. When Eli took his seat, he watched Eleanor sitting quietly by the stove, nursing a small cup of her own brew. He saw the way she watched the men eat, not with pride, but with the pragmatic satisfaction of a professional. She had controlled the room not with a whip or a shout, but with fire and flour. He pushed his plate forward for a modest second helping and nodded. "The job is yours. Vance, 30 days. We will settle the wages then?" Eleanor nodded back, not smiling, but a subtle ease settled around her shoulders. She had secured the first part of her plan. The kitchen was hers. But even as the aroma of baking bread began to chase the ghosts of old grease from the rafters, the friction was beginning to rub raw. News traveled fast in Dry Creek, carried on the dry wind and magnified by idleness. By the next morning, as Eleanor was kneading dough, 2 distinct and unpleasant rumors were circulating among the cowhands and filtering into town. "That cook just showed up out of nowhere. You think she is one of Pike's spies, sent to ruin the crew from the inside. She is too neat for a regular trail cook. Nah, she is too pretty to be a spy. Probably some kind of sweetheart or mistress from the city, trying to disappear. Whose mistress? Eli's. Did he send for her? The boss is usually too tight-lipped for that kind of trouble." The rumors were cruel and rooted in the deep suspicion that pervaded the frontier. Eli noticed the change in the atmosphere. His hands were still eating the food, but their gazes lingered on Eleanor, trying to place her, categorize her, and diminish her. Eleanor, immune to the crude jokes but sensitive to the shifting current of suspicion, felt the tightening. She understood that in the West, anonymity was both freedom and a liability. It left too much space for others to invent a past for you. Later that afternoon, riding into Dry Creek for supplies, Eli and Eleanor passed Sheriff Voss near the saloon. Voss was a man whose uniform barely hid the bloat of corruption. His movements slow, but his eyes quick and predatory. He looked directly at Eleanor, his gaze chillingly professional and yet deeply curious. He tipped his hat, a gesture that felt more like a threat than a courtesy. "Afternoon, McCord. Who is your new hire? Do not think I have seen her around before." "Eleanor Vance. Sheriff," Eli replied, his tone flat and uninviting. "New cook at Sweetwater." Voss's eyes narrowed slightly, lingering on Eleanor's profile, particularly the small, almost imperceptible way her hand instinctively covered the scar on her wrist. There was a flicker of recognition, or perhaps only a vague, troubling memory. "Vance," Voss repeated, dragging the name out. "Well, welcome to Dry Creek. Miss Vance, I do hope you keep your business clean. We do not take kindly to trouble brewing on our ground." Eleanor met his gaze calmly, a faint, almost defiant smile touching her lips. "I only brew coffee. Sheriff, strong and honest." The exchange was brief, but Eleanor felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. That look. It was the look of a lawman trying to fit a face to a wanted poster, a suspicion she had lived with for months. She had been seen, And now she was remembered, or at least suspected. She felt the heavy, suffocating sensation of the past finally catching up to her. Back at the ranch, the quiet domesticity of the kitchen became her fortress. As she scrubbed the heavy cast-iron skillet, she made a silent promise to herself, a declaration of intent that served as a thematic foundation for her time at Sweetwater. "I only need to stand firm in this kitchen," she thought, the scrubbing motion powerful and rhythmic. "All the gales outside, I will deal with those later, one by one." Eli, watching her from the tack room, polished his saddle, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility settling over him. He was tired of fighting the lawlessness of Pike, the oppression of the dry land, and the constant threat of ruin. He took a deep breath, the scent of fresh-cut hay and Eleanor's strong coffee mingling in the air. He made his own quiet vow. "Hold the water, hold the people," he told himself, checking the load in his revolver. "This season is going to be long." The cook was just a cook, but the fire she carried, Eli already suspected, was something far more important than the simple heat required to bake bread. It was the first true spark of light Sweetwater had seen in a long, dark time. The Sweetwater kitchen, under Eleanor Vance's command, transformed from a grease pit of despair into a model of functional discipline within a week. Her first action was to establish what she termed the kitchen culture, a strict but fair set of rules that governed the small, essential space. She began by imposing a rigorous cooking schedule, treating the day like a military timetable. 4:45 in the morning was coffee hour, a non-negotiable time when the immense enamel pot had to be steaming and strong. Then came bread hour, the rhythmic thumping of dough always preceding sunrise. She even allocated a portion of coarse salt to be set aside for the horses, insisting that the crew's care extended beyond their own plates. Her most controversial rules, however, concerned cleanliness and conduct. "No man uses another man's spoon," she announced to the assembled, rough-looking crew on her third morning, holding up a tarnished silver utensil. "In any dish you use, you clean. I am the cook. I am not your mother, and I am certainly not your scullery maid." Then came the final, non-negotiable law: no drinking of strong spirits in or near this kitchen. "You want to be drunk? You do it on your own time, far from my flame. I cannot trust a shaky hand near a full pot." The immediate reaction was a grumble of resentment. These were men accustomed to absolute freedom and the casual chaos of frontier life. Discipline, especially from a woman, tasted bitter, but the results were undeniable. The kitchen floor, once slick with grease, became manageable. The food, now predictable and delicious, offered a genuine comfort. Within a few days, the men began to enforce the rules themselves, realizing that a clean, safe kitchen meant reliably excellent meals. The initial friction found its release, not in outright defiance, but in good-natured, often witty, verbal sparring. Eleanor's quick wit, sharpened by years of navigating rowdy trail camps, made her a match for any of the cowhands. The primary opponent in these daily skirmishes was Owen, the tall, red-haired cowhand the others affectionately nicknamed Three Beans, due to his unwavering and highly opinionated devotion to pinto beans. The skirmish began one rainy afternoon over a cauldron of simmering potluck stew. "Now, Miss Vance," Three Beans said, leaning into the doorway, smelling strongly of horse and damp leather. "You call that a proper stew? Where are the 3 different kinds of beans? A proper man's stew has pintos for the body, black beans for the spirit, and some limas for the taste of green hope." Eleanor did not even look up from slicing fatback. "Owen, listen to me closely. A proper man's stew has whatever is available, and it is made by a cook who knows what she is doing. I have pintos, corn, and beef today. That is 3 things, all of them savory. You call a stew with lamus a stew of hope. I call it a stew of disappointment." The men listening chuckled, but Three Beans pressed on, his voice filled with theatrical offense. "Disappointment? Why, Miss Vance, you wound me deeply. Limas add complexity. They add texture." Eleanor finally turned, holding a heavy cast-iron pan in one hand and a tasting spoon in the other. She pointed the tasting spoon directly at him. "You want complexity. Owen, go wrestle a bobcat. You want sustenance for a man who has been sitting on a horse all day. You take my single bean, and you be grateful it is cooked perfectly." She scooped a spoonful of the stew and offered it to him. "Now, taste it, and if you dare say it needs a lima bean, you will be tasting this cast iron next." Three Beans took the spoonful, his eyes wide with mock terror, and savored the stew. A moment of silence stretched. "Well?" Eli McCord asked from his position near the woodpile, a faint smile hidden by his mustache. Owen swallowed and sighed with dramatic finality. It is damn near perfect. Miss Vance?" "Fine. I concede the point. For now. But I am still petitioning for a bean diversity program next month." The entire crew roared with laughter. Eleanor simply nodded, her expression entirely serious, and turned back to her work. The exchange, brief and witty, successfully established her dominance not through force, but through culinary skill and sharp humor, lightening the mood of the rough working ranch. Eli McCord, observing from the periphery, took careful note of these interactions. He saw the soft discipline she imposed, the way she managed to maintain order without ever raising her voice in a camp where shouting was the usual form of communication. He noticed the smaller, more profound details that spoke volumes about her character. He watched as she portioned out the beans and coffee, always counting, always setting aside enough for the two men working the farthest fence line who would return late. There was always a cover on the pot, a hot meal waiting for the last man in. One morning, he observed her setting an extra plate and fork on a small table near the stove. "Who is that for? Vance, everyone is accounted for," he inquired. Eleanor stirred the coffee, the morning light glinting off her severe, capable profile. "It is for the person who needs it most, Mr. McCord. Sometimes that is the unexpected visitor. Sometimes it is the man who is too tired or too proud to ask for the last portion. Sometimes it is me. It is a cushion, a small kindness." Eli realized then that he had not just hired a cook. He had hired someone with the fundamental, instinctive quality of a nurturer, someone driven by a need to sustain and protect the whole herd. It was a depth of character that went beyond the skillet, suggesting a woman who had herself known deprivation and vulnerability. The veneer of order, however, was brittle. Constantly threatened by the past Eleanor was hiding. One afternoon, a stranger rode up to the ranch, an itinerant leather worker looking for trade. Eleanor was outside the kitchen, stirring the horse's salt mash, when the man tied up his mount and casually tossed his heavy, coiled bull whip onto the rail fence. The sight of the whip made Eleanor freeze. It was not the whip itself, but the leather thong wrapped around its handle. Etched into the leather was a small, precise number, a specific code burned into the hide. It was the same distinctive marking style used by the Denver deputy fire marshals on their official equipment years ago, a marking she had seen repeatedly in the days before the warehouse blaze, when her pursuer had been consolidating his power. A cold panic seized her. Had he sent someone? Was this man an associate? The leather worker, oblivious, approached the kitchen. "Afternoon. Miss, that a pie I smell." Eleanor's mind raced. She forced her face into an expression of bland neutrality. "No pie, just sourdough starter being fed," she said, her voice a little too sharp. She kept her back to the whip, avoiding any question about the markings. She quickly asked him about his saddle repair prices, keeping the conversation strictly pragmatic until he rode off, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She told Eli nothing, but for the rest of the day. She kept a hunting knife tucked into the back of her apron. The arrival of a neighbor offered Eleanor a brief, welcome connection to the local, legitimate community. Hattie Rose, a widow from the next ranch over, was a woman whose wit was as sharp as her gaze. She wore clothes patched and clean, and drove a ramshackle wagon pulled by a mule with an attitude. Hattie had an easy, raucous laugh that cut through the silence of the plains. "You must be the miracle worker McCord has been keeping quiet," Hattie announced, walking straight into the kitchen, entirely ignoring the rule about asking permission. Hattie rose. "Do not mind the dirt. I'm trying to figure out if you are a cook or a missionary in disguise, making these heathens wash their own dishes." Eleanor laughed, a genuine, unfettered sound. She liked Hattie instantly. Hattie proved to be a valuable ally, both for company and for practical knowledge. She taught Eleanor the intricacies of water conservation in the dry climate, how to build a proper settling basin for collected water, and how to maximize every drop. She traded Eleanor a sack of sturdy, drought-resistant potato seeds for a lesson on making a particularly light and flaky pastry crust. "He is a good man, Eli McCord," Hattie confided, pouring them both a cup of Eleanor's strong coffee, tight-lipped but decent. "You watch out for that Pike fellow. He is a predator, and his sheriff is his lapdog." Hattie's immediate affection was a soothing balm, but the town's established society still held Eleanor at arm's length. This became clear during her first and only visit to the Dry Creek Church social. Mrs. Morrison, the matriarch of the town's few established families, was a woman whose judgment was as rigid as the stays beneath her formidable corset. She cornered Eleanor near the table laden with dry cookies. "It is a good, solid fate for a woman." "The kitchen, Mrs." Morrison remarked, her voice dripping with thinly veiled condescension. "It is a place of service. No sensible woman should dream too high above her true station." Eleanor smiled sweetly, her eyes retaining their quiet dignity. She was accustomed to such social sniping, having faced worse back east. "Mrs. Morrison, I appreciate the sentiment," Eleanor replied, her voice firm. "But the height of a kitchen is determined only by the spirit a person builds it with, and I plan to build mine as high as the sky allows." "Mrs." Morrison sniffed, clearly defeated by Eleanor's unyielding calmness, and huffed off, but her words cemented the societal barrier. Eleanor was a temporary fixture, a hired hand, and a target for their judgment. It was Eli McCord who provided the first definitive evidence of the outside oppression Hattie had warned about. One morning, the familiar rhythm of the ranch was broken by Jesse Boone rushing in with a face like thunder. "Boss, the north fence is cut and our yearlings are out on the public land." Eli, along with Three Beans and Jesse, raced out. It was a familiar trick. Pike's men, operating under cover of darkness, had cut the wire and driven the Sweetwater cattle onto the open range, mixing them with Pike's much larger herd. Within the hour, Sheriff Voss arrived on horseback, looking deliberately serious. "A shame, McCord. Poor maintenance," Voss said, completely ignoring the telltale clean cuts on the fence wire. "It is clearly a violation of the grazing ordinances to let your stock run loose. I am afraid I will have to issue a hefty fine, effective immediately. Consider it a fee for management of stray stock." Eli knew this was Pike's work, a calculated squeeze to deplete Sweetwater's funds. He stood with his shoulders back, absorbing the unfairness of the attack. "I will pay the fine." "Sheriff," Eli said, his voice quiet but dangerously controlled, "but do not try to tell me those cuts were made by an errant antelope. You and I both know who is behind this nonsense." "I only see poor fencing, McCord," Voss sneered, collecting the fine. "Good day." Eleanor had witnessed the entire degrading scene from the kitchen window. She saw Eli stand, rigid and proud, taking the blow for his land and his crew. The incident, small as it was, gave her a clear picture of the scale of the tyranny they were facing. The fight was not just against the land and the weather. It was against corruption that used the law as its weapon. The tension of the encounter was momentarily broken by an unexpected gift from the heavens. A rare, fierce summer cloud burst opened up, a torrent of life giving water slamming down on the parched earth. The kitchen, however, was not built to withstand such a storm. A loud drip, then a steady stream, began pouring from a weak spot in the old tin roof, directly above the simmering stew pot. Eleanor grabbed a bowl, but the flow was too fast. Eli, fresh from his confrontation with the sheriff, appeared in the doorway, shedding his oilskin coat. "Looks like the sky is trying to season your stew, Vance," he remarked, a rare, genuine spark of humor in his voice. "It is named with heaven, Mr. McCord," she retorted, scrambling for a piece of wood to prop up the sagging beam. Eli quickly found a stout piece of timber, and together, shoulder to shoulder, they leveraged it into place, securing the leaking roof just enough to redirect the flow. As they pushed the timber into the tight corner, Eleanor slipped slightly on the wet floor, and Eli's large, calloused hand shot out, catching her elbow and steadying her against his chest. The moment was fleeting, a small jolt of heat and proximity in the suddenly cool, wet air. They held the embrace for a heartbeat too long. They broke apart, both slightly flushed. They looked at the overflowing bowl of soup that had received the deluge. They started to laugh, a sudden, shared relief from the tension of the day and the unexpected intimacy. "Well," Eleanor said, wiping her hands on her apron, "that is one way to add flavor. Just a little sky spice." The shared laughter, the close touch, and the sense of having fixed a small piece of the world together created a quiet, small flash of connection between them, a fleeting intimacy that Eli carried with him as he went back outside. That sense of lightness, however, did not last through the evening. Later that night, long after the men had settled and the only light came from the banked fire in the stove, Eleanor felt the prickle of danger again. She was washing a stubborn pot when a scrape of leather. A hesitant footfall came from outside the kitchen window. She froze, every instinct honed by her life on the run, screaming alarm. She crept to the window, avoiding the patch of moonlight. She did not open it. Instead, she took her favorite paring knife, the sharpest one, and held it low against her skirt, the handle slick in her palm. She peered through the pane, catching only a fleeting glimpse of a dark shape retreating quickly from the light. But just before the shape vanished into the surrounding darkness, a pair of eyes caught the faint glow of the stars. They were cold, knowing eyes. The face was obscured, but the set of the jaw, the heavy shoulders, it was too familiar. It was the sheriff, Voss. He had come out to the ranch, not on official business, but to check on her, to confirm his suspicion, to remind her that she was not safe. Eleanor stood motionless until the sound of hoofbeats had long faded. She released her breath in a slow, careful stream, the smell of wood smoke and coffee suddenly smelling like fear. She was seen. The kitchen was not a perfect fortress. She walked to the knife block, returned the paring knife, and then, slowly, selected a much heavier, longer slicing knife, leaving it easily accessible on the cutting board. She did not sleep soundly that night. The quiet threat was no longer an idea, but a shadow on her doorstep. The season broke not with a gentle fade from summer, but with a sudden, violent shift. The men called it the Blue Norther, a brutal, unseasonal blast of cold wind that swept down from the high plains. One minute the air was hot and still. The next, it was a gale carrying the ominous promise of winter. On that particular morning, the sky curdled, turning from its familiar high blue to a sickening, heavy slate gray, the color of old iron. The wind hammered the bunkhouse, and the air filled with blinding, choking red dust, turning the visibility into a miserable, stinging shroud. It was the kind of wind that made cattle wild. A raw, deep sound rolled over the ranch, the sound of the herd panicking. Cattle are driven by instinct and fear. In a dust storm that obscures landmarks and muffles sound, their instinct is to stampede, crushing anything in their path. The danger was immediate and absolute. The fence lines would be breached, the barns might be destroyed, and men or animals could be trampled under the 1,000-pounding hooves. The dust was too thick to see more than a few yards. Eli McCord was shouting orders, his voice barely audible over the howl of the wind, trying to organize the scattered hands to secure the gates. Eleanor was in the kitchen, already battling the elements to keep the stove fire alive. The iron stove moaned under the wind's pressure. She glanced out the small, dirty window. She couldn't cook. She couldn't even see her ingredients. Her mission was no longer about sustenance. It was about survival. Without waiting for permission, she threw a handful of dry kindling and a splash of kerosene onto the banked coals, making the stove briefly roar. She grabbed the huge, heavy brass dinner bell from its hook, the bell she usually rang to signal mealtime. She ran out of the back door, pulling her scarf over her nose and mouth, squinting against the stinging dust. She scrambled onto the top rail of the closest corral fence, a hazardous position in the gale. Ignoring Eli's shouted command to get down, she began to swing the dinner bell wildly, rhythmically, making a clamorous, urgent sound that was both familiar and strange to the herd. Then, she did the truly peculiar thing. She opened the latch on the back of the stovepipe's vent, grabbed a shovel full of hot coals and smoldering wood chips, and quickly dumped them into a perforated tin bucket. The wind caught the heat, and the unmistakable, powerful scent of her sourdough starter, a sour, yeasty, warm, and comforting smell burned off the heat and began to waft into the turbulent air. It was a primitive, instinctive maneuver. In the blinding chaos, the cattle could not see or hear clearly, but they could smell, and they recognized the smell of the hearth, the smell of the kitchen, the smell of the place where their fear was habitually satisfied with food. Slowly, incredibly, the rhythmic clang of the bell and the strong, familiar odor of the sourdough began to work their strange magic. The closest groups of panicked steers began to turn their heavy bodies, moving uncertainly toward the sound and the scent, seeking the comfort of the accustomed ritual. They bunched up near the fence, confused but contained, instead of scattering wildly across the open range. Eli, grappling with a terrified gelding near the barn, paused. He had witnessed 1,000 ways to handle a panicked herd yelling, whips, pistols, riding hard, but he had never seen anyone call them back with a dinner bell and the smell of bread. He felt a surge of respect, tinged with a moment of pure, bewildered admiration for her radical instinct. Her methods were not textbook ranching. They were the oldest kind of shepherding. In the midst of the chaos, a terrible accident occurred. Jesse Boone, young and inexperienced, was struggling to secure a rolling coil of rope that had been lashed to a hay wagon. A large steer, spooked by a sudden crack of thunder, broke free and slammed its flank into the wagon. Jesse was hurled sideways, and his foot snagged in the rapidly uncoiling rope. The rope began to tighten, dragging him toward the perimeter fence where the panicked herd was still milling dangerously. Jesse, Eli roared, starting to run, but he was too far. Eleanor, still perched precariously on the fence, saw the boy's distress. She dropped the bell, leaping down instantly into the thick, swirling dust. She ran straight toward the boy, moving low and fast. The ground was slick with the earlier moisture and loose dust, making footing treacherous, but she was entirely focused. She reached Jesse just as the rope tightened dangerously around his ankle. The boy was coughing violently, his face already smeared with mud and grit, fighting the urge to breathe in the suffocating dust. Instead of trying to untangle the rope, a task too slow and complicated in the moment, Eleanor threw herself onto the ground. Ripping the clean handkerchief from her sleeve, she shoved the handkerchief deep into Jesse's mouth, sealing off his air passage against the worst of the swirling grit. "Hold your breath. Jesse, do not swallow the fire," she yelled, her own lungs burning. Then, with a desperate surge of strength, she grabbed the trailing rope and pulled, not to break it, but to loosen the tension on his foot just enough to give him clearance. Eli, reaching the scene a moment later with Three Beans close behind, seized the rope further down, together. The three of them, Eleanor pulling low. Eli and Three Beans hauling high, managed to snap the knot and drag the coughing, half-conscious Jesse out of the danger zone, pulling him behind the heavy wagon just as the main body of the herd shifted and pounded past. They collapsed in a heap, the roar of the wind and hooves deafening. Jesse was alive, terrified, and swallowing huge gulps of air. But safe. The immediate terror gave way to a brief, nervous moment of shared relief. Three Beans, spitting dust and adrenaline, clapped Eli on the shoulder. "Lord above, boss, we saved the boy now. For God's sake, someone check on the bean pot. If that wind blew the lid off and ruined the dinner, I'm going to cry." The remark, crude and perfectly timed, broke the tension. Eli, Eleanor, and Jesse all erupted into relieved, shaky laughter, a sound thin and fragile against the roar of the blue norther. Eleanor, pulling herself up, looked at Three Beans, her face streaked with tears and mud. "The beans can burn. Owen," she called out over the gale. "But the people do not." She was the first to return to work, her hands already checking the boy for deeper injuries. The storm began to abate as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind a world muted and covered in a thick layer of reddish-brown dust. Hardly had the wind dropped than Sheriff Voss rode in, his expression not one of concern, but of manufactured importance. He was always drawn to chaos, seeing it as an opportunity for extortion. He reined his horse near the newly bunched herd, shaking his head with mock disapproval. "Trouble. McCord. Looks like your fences are weak and your cattle are agitated. That is a danger to the entire territory." Eli stepped forward, his body language radiating cold fury. "The only danger here, Voss, is a natural storm, not poor fencing, and thanks to my cook, the herd is secure." Voss ignored Eli, casting a sidelong, calculating glance at Eleanor, who was helping a stunned Jesse toward the bunkhouse. "This kind of incident costs the county resources. McCord," Voss insisted, resting his hand pointedly on the butt of his pistol. "Maybe I should assign a deputy here for herd security for the season. For a fee, of course, to make sure your stock remains calm." "I do not pay protection money, Sheriff," Eli said simply. "And my herd is calm because the cook rang a bell and burned some yeast. We do not need your help." Eleanor paused, turning back from the doorway. She did not engage the sheriff, but her eyes locked onto him. She watched him speak, watched the avarice in his eyes, and filed away the words "fee for security," "danger to the territory." She recognized the pattern of calculated harassment and intimidation that Pike and his men used. She was now a witness and a participant in Eli's struggle. The work of recovery began immediately after the sheriff rode off, defeated but clearly plotting. The rest of the afternoon and well into the night, the entire ranch was involved in repairing the damage. Men worked silently, their shoulders hunched against the lingering cold. They replaced fallen posts, restretched wire, and shoveled mountains of dust from the stable floors. Eleanor worked just as hard, but, in her own way, she cooked kettles of thick, concentrated coffee, so strong it seemed to melt the fatigue out of the men's bones. She handed out thick, salted biscuits, wrapping them in strips of linen to keep them warm. She moved from one man to the next, offering food, water, and sometimes just a steadying presence. In the glow of the kerosene lamps, as the men repaired a broken gate, Eleanor watched them. They were rough, their hands scarred, their language often crude, but their labor was honest and deeply proud. They were repairing not just a fence, but their livelihood, their commitment to the land. She recognized the sincerity of their effort, the rough decency that underlay their cowboy swagger. They were, she realized, good people fighting an exhausting, constant battle against a hard environment and a cruel adversary. Around midnight, Eli finished securing the last post near the main barn. He walked into the kitchen, his face grimy, his hands bleeding in a couple of places. Eleanor poured him a fresh cup of coffee. As he drank, she walked to the locked, heavy iron door of the ranch's main larder, where all the non-perishable staples and expensive canned goods were kept. She took the heavy brass key, the only key from a nail above the door. She walked over to Eli and placed the key, cold and heavy, into his palm. "I am finished in here. You secure the rations, Mr. McCord. I am responsible for the stove. You are responsible for the store. Eli looked down at the key, then up at her. He recognized the profound gesture of trust. Rations were the lifeblood of a ranch, often worth more than the payroll. To give him the key was an acknowledgement that she was working for the ranch's survival, not just for her own wage. Eli closed his fingers around the key, but did not pocket it. Instead, he returned it to her. "You keep it, Vance," he said, his voice low. "You earned it today, and you proved that you understand what is truly valuable. Out here, water is precious as gold, but food and the person who knows how to make it last is more precious still." It was the highest compliment he could have paid her, a fundamental acknowledgement of her competence and loyalty. Eleanor accepted the key, the brass now warm from their shared touch, and hung it on her apron string. She felt a wave of warmth, a feeling of finally being trusted, replacing the constant chill of suspicion she had lived under. But trust was a dangerous thing for a woman on the run. A short while later, as Eli sat by the banked stove, nursing his coffee, Eleanor was tossing a last piece of cottonwood onto the cooling embers. As the wood caught, it flared up briefly, illuminating the small room with a sudden, violent burst of light. At the sight of the sudden, aggressive flame, Eleanor flinched, a sharp, involuntary tremor running through her body. Her hand, which was reaching for a cup, began to shake visibly. The flare of light, the quick, hungry snap of the fire. It was a sudden, unwelcome portal back to that night in Denver, the memory of the warehouse, the towering, hungry inferno, the heat on her skin, the screams. It all flooded back in a dizzying second. She was momentarily paralyzed, her eyes wide with unacknowledged trauma. Eli saw it. He saw the way her face lost its color and the uncontrolled tremble in her hand. He did not need an explanation. The reaction was too primal, too real. It was the movement of someone who had seen true terror in a fire. He did not ask what she saw. He did not mention Denver or the rumors. He simply took the poker, adjusted the new piece of wood, and carefully banked the fire with damp ashes, smoothing the flames until they receded into a quiet, warm, and steady glow. "Too much snap in that cottonwood," he murmured, his gaze steady and kind. "Burns too fast. Better to use the oak. It is a slow, easy heat that holds all night." Eleanor took a slow, deep breath, anchoring herself in the present reality of the Sweetwater kitchen. "Yes, Mr. McCord," she whispered, her voice still rough. "A slow, easy heat. That is the best kind." Eli nodded once, acknowledging her fear without exploiting it, and without demanding to know her secrets. He had given her a moment of quiet grace, a recognition that the past was a burn that needed to be treated gently, not pulled open for inspection. The ranch was safe, the herd was calm, and a deep seed of mutual trust had been planted in the smoky, dusty air. But the fire's reminder confirmed that Eleanor's hidden past was a wound that the peaceful rhythm of Sweetwater could not hold back forever. It was a ticking clock in the middle of a peaceful camp. The late summer gave way to a brief, deceptive stretch of cool, clear weather, signaled by the arrival of the annual Dry Creek Fall Fair. For Eleanor, it was an obligation and an opportunity, a chance to cement her status, not just as Eli McCord's cook, but as a respectable member of the small, cautious community. Hattie Rose insisted Eleanor enter the baking competition. "They may call you Vance, but they judge you by your sourdough," Hattie declared, polishing Eleanor's favorite mixing bowl until it gleamed. Eleanor prepared 2 entries, her famous sourdough bread, complex and nutty with a perfect crust, and a deeply spiced apple stack cake, utilizing the last of the season's small, tart fruit. The fair was a riot of color and dust gingham dresses, oiled leather, and the smells of cheap tobacco mixing with frying food and livestock. The baking pavilion was the center of genteel attention and sharp social judgment. When the judges announced the winners, Eleanor's sourdough took second place, and her apple cake secured an honorable mention. The quality was undeniable. Even Mrs. Morrison had to reluctantly admit that the bread was remarkably well risen for a traveling cook. Slowly, the local residents began to shed some of their initial wariness, finding it difficult to hold on to prejudice when faced with such delicious reality. A small crowd gathered around Eleanor's table, praising the tang of the bread and the texture of the cake. But the moment of triumph was swiftly and cruelly curtailed. Bartholomew Pike, the enormous rancher, swaggered into the tent with Sheriff Voss trailing him. Pike, smelling of expensive cologne and contempt, swept past the judges and, with a dismissive gesture, bought every single item Eleanor had entered. "A fine display, Miss Vance," Pike drawled, his voice loud enough for the whole pavilion to hear. "But the Sweetwater herd needs better than fancy cakes. I'll take them all, for the pigs." He then carried the armful of perfectly baked goods just outside the tent and deliberately threw them, piece by precious piece, into the nearest trough. It was a crude, public act of humiliation, designed to remind everyone of Eleanor's position and Eli's in the town's hierarchy. Eleanor felt the heat rise in her neck, but she did not move. Eli, who was watching from the edge of the crowd, clenched his jaw. Before anyone could speak, Eleanor offered a faint, almost pitying smile toward Pike. "That is a shame. Mr. Pike, my pigs prefer the rye flour, but I suppose a hungry pig cannot be too picky about quality, can it?" She walked away with her head held high, leaving the crowd murmuring, having effectively turned his public insult into a display of his petty wastefulness. The crowd's mood, however, lightened quickly when Eleanor, still fired up from the public slight, got into a verbal tangle with one of Pike's hulking butchers near the meat stall. The butcher, a man named Denton, was boasting loudly about the quality of Pike's salt-cured beef. "The secret is the suet we use pure, rendered beef fat, not that store-bought hog grease you cooks use." Eleanor stopped, resting a hand on her hip. "Hog grease has its uses, Denton, but since you brought up the topic of beef fat and salt, I have a question." "Go on then, little cook," Denton sneered. "If you cure your beef with so much high-quality suet, why do I have to hack through a half-inch of crystallized, bitter salt every time I try to render a good piece of Pike's meat down?" she challenged, her voice clear. "And if your salt is so pure, why does the bottom of my roasting pan look like an old copper mine when I am finished?" The crowd chuckled. She wasn't accusing him of bad meat, but of bad curing practices, an insult to his professional skill. "The salt is pure," Denton bellowed, red-faced. Eleanor stepped closer, holding up the tiny silver tasting fork from her apron pocket, the only remnant of her old, refined life. She tapped the fork gently against the butcher's immense, blood-stained hand. "Denton, the secret to preserving is the balance of the preservative, not the quantity. Too much salt is simply ignorance disguised as brute strength. I win the argument." With a fork. The blacksmith, the livery owner, and several cowhands erupted into delighted laughter. She had humiliated one of Pike's men using nothing but common culinary knowledge and wit. The sound of their genuine amusement was sweeter than any first-place ribbon. She had won the crowd, at least for the day. But the past was closing in, relentless and cold. As Eleanor was retrieving her small luggage from the stagecoach office, she noticed a splintered wooden crate being hauled off a freight wagon newly arrived from Denver. A folded, brittle newspaper had fallen out of the crate and lay half-buried in the dust. The headline was still legible: "Warehouse Fire Arson Suspect Escapes." The photo beneath was a poorly rendered lithograph, but the features, the determined jaw, the severe braid were unmistakably hers. She quickly snatched the paper, folding it tight, but as she did, she felt a familiar, chilling presence. Sheriff Voss was leaning against a post nearby, idly chewing tobacco, watching her with a lazy, calculating smirk. He hadn't seen the paper, but he had seen her unnatural speed and her immediate tension. He spat a stream of dark juice onto the ground. "Something interesting in the dirt. Miss Vance, looks like you found trouble." "Just an old flyer," Eleanor said, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was calm, though, accustomed to lying with her face. Reminded me to pick up laundry soap. Voss just chuckled a dry, rasping sound. Right, soap. You keep yourself clean. Miss Vance, Denver's a long way off, but some smells carry mighty far on the wind. He walked away, not challenging her, but having made his intent and his suspicion perfectly clear. That evening, Eli found Eleanor in the quiet solitude of the kitchen, carefully shredding the old Denver newspaper into tiny, unreadable scraps and feeding them into the back of the stove. He pulled up a stool beside her, placing a fresh copy of the same paper on the table. It was the weekly Dry Creek Gazette, but the back page carried a brief bulletin reprinted from a Denver circular, detailing the escape of a female arson suspect named Eleanor Wynne, alias Eleanor Ward. Eli placed his hand over the headline, a gesture of shielding rather than accusation. We have been through a blue norther, Miss Vance. We have fought the herd and the sheriff. That gives us a certain kind of honesty. He looked at her, his eyes steady, utterly without judgment. If you need to speak about what is in this paper, I will listen, and what is said here stays here, no matter what is printed. Eleanor stared at the paper, then at Eli's patient, determined face. The offer was so simple, so profoundly kind, that it nearly broke the dam of her guarded emotions. He wasn't threatening her. He was offering sanctuary. Sight unseen. She looked at the description, arson suspect. She wanted to tell him everything, the corrupt deputy, the forced marriage, the frame-up, the fear, but the habit of secrecy, the fear of exposing him to her danger, was too strong. She reached out and gently slid the paper away from his hand, folding it neatly. She pushed it back toward him. "Thank you, Mr. McCord," she said, her voice barely a whisper, thick with unsaid gratitude. "The paper is mistaken. I am Eleanor Vance, and I am working for you. That is all there is to say." She could not bring herself to confess, but her eyes, those honest eyes, conveyed the truth of her innocence and the depth of her gratefulness that he had not pressed her. Eli looked at her, then at the paper, then pocketed the Gazette without another word. He understood that she had given him the only answer she could afford. The danger from Denver was real, but the immediate threat was the deepening drought. The ranch required a new strategy, and Eleanor, having proved her competence and loyalty during the Blue Norther, was now fully integrated into the ranch's decision-making core. A small, quiet alliance was formed. Meeting in the kitchen after dark, it included Hattie Rose, whose knowledge of local resources was invaluable, Jesse Boone, whose youth gave him quick energy, Three Beans, whose pragmatism was surprising, and Eleanor herself. Their goal, radical water conservation. They drew up plans on the back of a flour sack, the construction of a simple settling basin near the stream to catch and filter water more efficiently, a system of divided troughs to allocate water strictly between the drinking stock and the working horses, and a complete overhaul of the menu to eliminate anything that required excessive water for preparation or washing. Eli came in, surveyed the flour sack diagram, and nodded. "We will start digging the basin tomorrow. Jesse, you are on water duty. Three Beans. You are helping Vance with the cooking changes. Anything she says about the supply is law." He had officially handed Eleanor the authority over the ranch's entire supply chain, a rare and significant promotion for a woman on a working cattle ranch in the 1870s. She was the commissary general, and her word was final. The first tangible consequence of her secret past arrived one morning in the form of a small, hateful piece of paper. Eleanor found the scrap folded and shoved under the back door of the kitchen. In crude block letters, the message read, "Arsonist." The handwriting was a rough scrawl, but she recognized the thick, careless strokes. It was the same style she had seen on the county inventory receipts that Sheriff Voss had carelessly signed. He wasn't just suspicious. He was taunting her, reminding her that he knew her secret and held her fate in his hands. Eleanor walked straight to the stove. She lifted a heavy cast-iron frying pan, still hot from the morning biscuits. She placed the slip of paper onto the blackened surface and watched, without a flicker of emotion, as the paper curled, blackened, and vanished into a thin wisp of smoke and a brief, sharp, acrid smell. Tro nuai dat, she thought, remembering her grandmother's saying, ashes feed the soil. The threat was acknowledged, burned, and dissolved. She would not run from it, but she would not let it paralyze her. The relentless work and the shared danger only strengthened the quiet bond between Eli and Eleanor. One night, a light but steady rain fell, the first meaningful moisture since the blue norther. Eli had been outside fixing a loose shingle on the kitchen eaves, finishing a repair he had meant to do for weeks. He climbed down, satisfied, just as the rain began to patter rhythmically on the corrugated tin of the new roof section. Eleanor was standing under the small, sheltered portion of the porch, a mug of hot coffee warming her hands. "Thank you, Mr. McCord," she said softly, gesturing to the dry interior. "I appreciate a dry ceiling over my head." Eli leaned against the wooden support beam next to her. They stood in silence. Not needing to fill the space with talk, the air smelled intensely of rain on dust and the rich aroma of his pipe tobacco mixing with her mint tea. They listened to the hypnotic drumming of the water on the tin, a sound of profound peace on the arid plains. The silence between them was not the awkward gap of strangers, but the comfortable, deep quiet of two people whose burdens were known to each other, even if those burdens were unstated. They stood shoulder to shoulder, feeling the gentle dampness of the air, the physical proximity, and the unspoken acknowledgement that they were fighting the same battle, side by side. The simple act of sharing the dry space spoke volumes, a powerful form of wordless conversation. But the silence was shattered the next morning by the harsh realities of the town's oppression. Pike launched his next assault. He dramatically increased the fee charged at his slaughterhouse, effectively choking off Sweetwater's market access. More brutally, he used his influence to have the town council order the closure of the secondary irrigation gate, cutting off a crucial trickle of water Eli relied on during the peak dry period. Sweetwater was now severely parched, its immediate water source dwindling dangerously. Eli was forced to face the agonizing decision of selling off a portion of his herd, a desperate, loss-making move just to keep the remaining cattle alive until the end of the season. "He is trying to starve us out." "Vance," Eli said, looking out at the cracked earth. "He knows I cannot pay his prices or endure this drought without that gate. I might have to liquidate 50 head just to secure enough feed and water." Eleanor stood beside him, her hands clenched on the rough wood of the fence. The fight had escalated from subtle harassment to a full-scale war for the ranch's survival. Her kitchen, her sanctuary, was now on the front line of a very real conflict. They needed a miracle, and they needed it fast. The town council was clearly in Pike's pocket, and the law offered no recourse. The heat of the conflict was rising, and soon, something had to break. The end of that difficult week arrived with a palpable sense of exhaustion. The intense drought and the pressure from Pike had worn the crew thin. Eleanor decided to spend one of her last valuable cans of preserved tomatoes, a rare luxury, to make a true, substantial meal. She spent the afternoon creating a rich, deeply flavored pot of slow-simmered beef stew, utilizing the last of their good, fresh beef before Eli had to start liquidating the stock. She baked thick, savory cornbread and brewed a new batch of coffee, strong and dark. It was a transition meal, marking the end of the relative calm and the beginning of the ranch's final, desperate struggle. That evening, the men ate in a silence heavier than before, a silence born not of appreciation but of weariness and worry. When the meal was done and the men drifted off, Eli remained. He walked back into the kitchen where Eleanor was meticulously scrubbing the stew pot, her movements slow and deliberate. The kerosene lamp cast a warm, isolated circle of light. It was in this private, intimate space that Eleanor finally put down the burden she had carried for so long. "Mr. McCord," she began, her voice low, focused entirely on the heavy iron she was scrubbing. "The paper you showed me a few weeks ago, the one about the arsonist in Denver. Eli leaned against the doorframe, his presence solid and patient. "I remember it. Vance." Eleanor stopped scrubbing, her hand resting on the lip of the pot. She did not look at him. She looked at the flame licking the back of the stove, small and contained. The name they printed was Eleanor Wynne. That is my real name. Vance is the name I took to get clear of Colorado. She took a deep breath, the confession physically painful. I was framed. I saw the fire start. I was working for a freight company, and the deputy fire marshal, a powerful man who wanted me to marry him, he set the blaze after I refused. He blamed me for the whole thing and tried to silence me. The scar on my wrist. She lifted her left hand, exposing the faint, pale line. That is where the handcuffs were. I ran from the jailhouse yard a year ago to save myself from a false charge, a false marriage, and a true execution. The silence that followed was absolute, filled only by the gentle simmer of the remaining coffee. She finally turned to face him, her eyes pleading for belief, even as her posture remained ready to flee. "I am not a criminal, Eli. I am just a cook who needs to disappear long enough to earn a clean life." Eli did not ask for details about the deputy, or the fire, or the escape. He didn't ask how she survived. He simply absorbed the story, processing it through the filter of his own experience, the scars of war, the betrayal of officials, the rough justice of the West. "I believe you, Eleanor," he said, using her true name for the first time, a sound that resonated with surprising warmth. He walked toward her, resting his large hand on the heavy iron stove, feeling the constant, reliable warmth beneath his palm. "I don't judge a person's truth by what is burned behind them," Eli stated quietly. "People are measured by the way they stand up after the burning. You ran from a lie, and you ran toward work, toward honesty, and toward feeding my crew. That tells me everything I need to know about your character." It was the most profound validation Eleanor had ever received. He had seen the whole history, the terrible past, and judged her worthy. Eli looked from her to the low, comforting heat of the slow-burning wood in the stove, then back to the quiet dignity in her eyes. He spoke, the words half a joke, half a solemn truth. Marking the midpoint of their journey, a statement of their connection rooted in the honest realities of the ranch. "The ranch hired you to cook, but only I know your heat could burn sweeter than any fire." Eleanor felt the blood rush into her cheeks. A genuine blush she hadn't experienced since she was a girl. The compliment was rough, sincere, and utterly disarming. It acknowledged the danger and the passion in her, the fire within her spirit, and claimed it as something valuable, something sweet. She laughed, a quick, nervous sound. "Just so long as I don't actually burn the kitchen down, Mr. McCord." The shared laughter faded into a charged silence. The flickering light of the kerosene lamp seemed to draw the world closer around them. He reached out, taking her hand, the one that had the scar, and held it, his thumb slowly tracing the faint, pale line. She did not pull away. She moved closer, resting her forehead gently against his, closing her eyes, feeling the texture of his skin, the familiar scent of wood smoke and saddle soap. It was a perfect, wordless connection, a promise held in the shared warmth of breath. Then, Eli lowered his head. The kiss was gentle, firm, and as absolute as a vow. It was the sealing of a partnership forged in flour and fire, a quiet declaration of commitment. The world outside the lamplight ceased to exist. In the intimacy of the small kitchen, surrounded by the tools of their labor, they simply held each other, the quiet reality of their commitment surpassing the necessity of words. The moment was perfect and complete, a silent promise under the guardianship of the flickering flame. They emerged from the kitchen before dawn, prepared for a new day, stronger, but also newly vulnerable. The outside world, however, had already struck its next blow. As the cowhands stumbled out for their pre-dawn coffee, Jesse Boone let out a startled shout near the secondary stream bed. The creek, Sweetwater's lifeline, was tainted. The clear, Vital water had been polluted with a heavy, unnatural purple dye that coated the rocks and floated in viscous, shimmering slicks. The cattle, sensing the poison, would not touch it. Poison, Three Beans hissed. Confirming the obvious, they dyed the water. The herd won't drink that for days, maybe a week. Eli knelt by the bank, his jaw tight. He picked up a fragment of the contaminated water. Examining the heavy, synthetic pigment, it was the work of Pike's men, a devastating, calculated act of sabotage. The delay caused by the contamination meant the ranch might not survive the drought. Among the hoof prints left by the saboteurs, Eli spotted a distinctive, heavy-set mark. The print of a specific shoe Eli knew belonged to Pike's foreman, a man named Denton. The situation demanded immediate, radical action. Eleanor, her mind already racing through the logistical challenges, stepped forward. We cannot wait for the water to clear. Eli, we are already losing strength. We have to move them. We need to drive the herd at night, when the air is cool and they need less water. Night drives were risky and unconventional, but she had a key element to propose. And we use the bread, she continued, her eyes fixed on the distant, dry grazing lands. We use the smell of the baking sourdough, not to call them home, but to draw them forward. They will follow the promise of the hearth. We drive them toward the secondary. Smaller springs in the far canyon. Pike did not think we would use them this early. Eli looked at her. It was audacious. A plan that relied on instinct and scent memory rather than conventional herding techniques. But it was brilliant, utilizing her unique skill set, the art of sustenance, as a survival tactic. Eli McCord nodded, his decision absolute. He drew himself up, addressing the men, but his gaze remained fixed on Eleanor. Vance is in command of the drive supply chain, the timing, and the movement plan, Eli announced, his voice carrying the full weight of his authority. Her word is law on this drive. We ride when she says, and we move where the sourdough leads. It was an unprecedented act of trust and recognition. In the rough, male-dominated world of 1876 ranching, to grant a woman such control over a crucial cattle drive was a sign of absolute faith in her capabilities. Eleanor felt the weight of the responsibility, but also the rush of purpose. But the danger closing in was not just from the contaminated water. Eli returned from a quick, scouting trip to the town hall, and his face was grim. Voss received a wire this morning, Eli reported, handing Eleanor a crumpled slip of official paper. It is a requisition for capture from the Denver Territorial Courts. They have a full alias list now. Eleanor Wynne, alias Eleanor Ward, alias Eleanor Vance. The description is specific. They are formally demanding your extradition. The paper trembled in Eleanor's hand. The legal framework of her past had finally reached her. He is going to use the law against us, Eli stated flatly. Voss has taken the requisition to the local town council. They are scheduled to convene in 2 weeks. He intends to use the drought crisis to justify capturing you, claiming that an arson suspect cannot be trusted with the ranch's survival, undermining the crew's morale, and forcing me to sell to Pike. Eleanor felt the chill of the jail cell again, but it was mixed now with the powerful warmth of the previous night's promise. Then we have 2 weeks, Eleanor declared, her voice steady, returning the fight to her eyes. 2 weeks to save the herd, break Pike's hold, and win the fight before the law takes me back. The stakes were clear survival of the ranch and Eleanor's freedom. The battle had begun, and the clock was ticking, counting down to the day the town council would decide her fate. The fire that Eli spoke of, the fire of her spirit, was about to face its greatest trial. The pressure on Sweetwater intensified immediately. Bartholomew Pike, sensing weakness, rode out to the ranch himself, accompanied by a notary public, not Sheriff Voss. This time, Pike wasn't offering threats. He was offering a contract. McCord, Pike said, dismounting with the deliberate heaviness of a man who owned everything he stood upon. I see your situation. Contaminated water, failed drive plan, and now the law is interested in your kitchen staff. It is a long way down to rock bottom. Son. He unfolded a document, I will buy 50 head of your best breeding stock, right now, at a slightly discounted price. In return, I guarantee you access to my primary water trough for the remainder of the season, enough to keep the rest of your herd stable. Eli knew the offer was the tightest kind of noose. Selling the breeding stock would gut the ranch's future, and the water guarantee was contingent on Pike's mercurial goodwill, a goodwill that could vanish the moment the contract was signed. It was a deal designed to cripple Sweetwater forever, making it a mere satellite to Pike's empire. Your generosity is choking. Pike, Eli replied, his voice flat. He took the contract and, without even reading the fine print, tore it neatly in half. My answer is no. We will take our chances with the drought. Pike's face flushed with cold rage. You think you can fight the drought, McCord maybe, but let us see if you can fight the law. That woman of yours is a liability, and soon you will be too. The threat was immediately realized. The next morning, Eli and the main crew were miles out, securing the furthest fences against another potential stampede. Eleanor was alone in the kitchen, churning butter. When the door slammed open, it was Sheriff Voss. He moved fast, his face set in an expression of oily, self-righteous authority. Eleanor Vance, alias Wynne, alias Ward, Voss barked, his eyes sweeping the room. Looking for proof. By the power vested in me by the territorial law, I am here to search this property and question you regarding your fugitive status. Produce your papers. Eleanor stood motionless behind the massive butcher block, a butter paddle in her hand. Her mind flashed if he found the small, hidden lockbox containing her Denver belongings, a single letter, and an old locket. Eli would be implicated in harboring a fugitive. You have no right to search without a proper warrant, Sheriff, Eleanor stated, her voice tight. I have reason to suspect arson materials, Miss Vance, Voss sneered, walking toward the wooden pantry, and I have a Denver requisition. That is all the warrant I need. Before Voss could open the pantry door, the entrance was blocked. Hattie Rose and young Jesse Boone, who had been chopping kindling nearby, were standing shoulder to shoulder in the doorway. Hattie's face, usually wreathed in a wry smile, was stone cold. Sheriff Voss, Hattie said, her voice surprisingly steady, considering the heavy revolver she was not holding. I am a respectable widow and a tax-paying resident of Dry Creek, and I can testify that Eleanor Vance is right now cooking a full meal for the men who are keeping this whole section of the county running. She is cooking for the good of the community. I am performing my duty, Voss shouted. Jesse, usually shy, took a step forward. She is making the sick soup for my brother. Sheriff, he is still weak from the dust. If you stop her from cooking, you are denying care to a minor. Hattie added the final, decisive blow. The town council is meeting to decide her fate next week. If you harass a woman who is demonstrably performing a service for the good of the ranching community before she has been officially extradited, it will look bad. Sheriff, very, very bad. It will look like persecution. Voss hesitated. He was a bully, not a tactician. He realized that searching the cook's quarters while she was preparing food and with two witnesses present, one a respected widow, the other a local boy, would indeed look like he was disrupting the ranch's labor force for personal vengeance. He would be giving Eli McCord ammunition for the council meeting. Voss slammed his hand on the table. This is not over. Vance, you are on notice. You breathe on the town council's goodwill. Do not leave this ranch. He spun around and stormed out, defeated by the combined moral authority of a kitchen and a stubborn neighbor. The victory was fleeting. That night, the darkness came early, heavy and silent. At around 2 a.m, Eleanor woke to the terrifying smell of smoke, not the comforting smell of banked wood, but the sharp, acrid scent of dry straw burning aggressively. She scrambled out of bed just as the watchman's shout pierced the night. The main hay and feed barn, located 50 yards from the bunkhouse, was engulfed. A professional, quick-moving fire. Eleanor stood frozen, the heat of the blaze hitting her face, the sound of the crackling fire a direct, horrifying echo of the Denver warehouse inferno. She saw the towering orange and yellow light against the black sky, and the old panic seized her. Her hands flew up, covering her face, her body rigid with remembered terror. But the sight of the men running toward the flames, trying to save the remaining feed, and the sound of Three Beans coughing violently from inside a narrow section of the feed loft snapped her out of the paralysis. Instinct, sharpened by necessity and the need to protect the men who had become her family, overcame her trauma. She ripped a heavy, wet blanket from the communal wash line and charged toward the barn. The heat was immense, forcing the men back, but she saw the red hair of Three Beans slumped near a half-closed hatchway. She plunged into the smoke, ignoring the searing heat and the voice of fear in her own mind. She found Three Beans on his knees, unable to move, his lungs filled with caustic smoke, with a primal surge of strength. She looped the wet blanket around his chest and hauled him out through the narrow opening, dragging him clear just as a section of the roof collapsed in a shower of sparks. The fire was contained only after hours of brutal, back-breaking work, but the barn was a total loss, and all the winter feed was destroyed. Three Beans was alive, but sputtering with a deep, rattling cough. Eli surveyed the wreckage in the cold, gray dawn. His entire winter capital, the feed for the coming season, was reduced to smoldering ash. It was a catastrophe designed to break him. Eleanor watched him, seeing his large body tremble, not from cold, but from despair, as he looked at the ruin. He ran his hand through his hair, leaving trails of soot. His eyes, usually so steady, were wide with disbelief and loss. It was all his hard work, all his hope, reduced to nothing. Eleanor walked up to him, placing a soot-covered hand gently on his arm. She felt the depth of his despair, the fear that this was the end of Sweetwater. She looked from the ashes back toward the town, toward the man who had done this. Pike, Voss, the corrupt system. The trauma of the fire had returned, but it had brought with it a fierce, unyielding resolve. She looked at Eli. "I am not running," she stated, her voice hoarse from the smoke but utterly firm. "If they want to arrest me, I will stand here, but first we save this ranch and this season. We do not quit because they used fire." Her commitment was a silent command. Eli looked at her, the woman framed for arson, standing amidst the real arson's devastation, refusing to flee. He nodded, regaining his composure. They were going to fight. The destruction of the feed barn demanded a radical shift in survival strategy, a pillow fight against the drought, battling for every small gain. The entire ranch community became a hive of frantic, innovative activity. Since they could no longer afford to buy feed, they had to conserve and innovate. The men built temporary, shallow irrigation ditches to reroute the last available groundwater to keep a small patch of forage alive. Eleanor, leading the Small Kitchen Alliance, had the most extreme task. They hung dozens of worn canvas tarps and blankets over frames to catch the morning dew and condensed moisture, funneling the precious drops into buckets. Hattie taught them to use salvaged mirror fragments and magnifying glasses to build crude solar cookers, drastically reducing the need for firewood and, more importantly, saving the limited water used to put out the cooking fire each night. Eleanor ruthlessly changed the menu. It was now a cycle of beans, biscuits, and cured meat, all requiring minimal water for preparation or cleanup. She learned to steam clean the pots with damp cloths and vinegar, saving every ounce of dishwater to pour on the vegetable patch. Meanwhile, Eli and his few trusted hands focused on gathering evidence against Pike and Voss. The stakes were too high for mere suspicion. Eli spent hours near the charred ruins, finding the tracks, the precise, heavy groove marks of Pike's foreman's horseshoe near the barn. He then tracked the path of the contaminated water, finding traces of the purple dye still clinging to the bank rocks and in the tire tracks of a wagon that had clearly dumped the chemical upstream. Jesse Boone, acting as a discreet spy, performed the riskiest task. He managed to track one of Pike's known henchmen into town and observed him entering a dry goods warehouse, emerging later with a heavy sack. Jesse risked a quick peek inside the warehouse and saw barrels marked with chemical hazard signs, the same dye used in the stream, and a type of volatile oil known to accelerate fires. Jesse procured a handwritten receipt showing the sale of the chemical to Pike's company. The evidence was mounting horseshoe prints, cut fences, dye in the water, and a paper trail leading back to Pike's chemical stores. In the midst of the chaos and the desperate struggle, small moments of profound intimacy persisted. Eli had suffered minor burns on his hands and arms while pulling wood from the fire line. Eleanor treated the burns in the quiet of the kitchen, carefully applying a salve of tallow and herbs. Eli sat still, captivated by her focused, gentle touch. "You are very brave with fire, Miss Vance," Eli murmured, watching her work, "though you are very vocal about its dangers." Eleanor smiled, a tired, genuine smile. "I may be loud against fire, Mr. McCord, but fire does not listen to words." Eli met her gaze, his expression softening. "It doesn't listen to words, no, but I think it listens to your skillet. That fire listens to your heat." "It listens to my pen," Eleanor corrected him gently, wrapping the bandage tight. "No," Eli insisted, lifting his hand slightly, the pressure of his touch soft on her fingers. "It listens to your spirit. It knows you are stronger than it is." It was another acknowledgement of her inner fire, a deep expression of care wrapped in a simple compliment. The political situation was now dire. The town council was set to hear the sheriff's request for Eleanor's extradition in less than a week. The council members were all merchants or landowners dependent on Pike's business. Pike believed that the destruction of the barn, coupled with the threat of the law, would force Eli to concede and sell off his land and stock before the council could even meet. Eli knew the council was compromised. He had the evidence, but Pike had the influence, the money, and the power of the false legal writ. The future of Sweetwater would be decided not by law, but by their ability to survive the climax of the drought, which was still to come. They had one final, desperate chance to save the ranch, and it was quickly approaching zero. The final battle would be fought on two fronts: the relentless nature of the frontier and the ruthless, corrupt ambition of Bartholomew Pike. The inevitable conflict arrived not on the day of the town council meeting, but in the dead of the night, driven by the unpredictable fury of the plains. It was a second, unseasonable blue norther, but this time it brought snow, the white wind. The wind howled a terrifying pre-winter song, bitter cold, whipping dust and fine, hard pellets of snow across the plains. The combined shock of the rapid temperature drop, the dust and the snow sent the half-starved Sweetwater herd into a state of blind, frantic panic. The cattle, seeking shelter and driven by instinct, began stampeding toward the only geographical landmark offering temporary refuge, the narrow, steep-walled gorge known as Sweetwater Canyon. This was the place where Pike, anticipating this very movement, had recently completed a sturdy, professional fence, designed to box in and trap the stock. It was a perfect choke point, a death trap that would force Eli to surrender the herd to Pike's mercy. Eli, rousted by the shouts and the terrible thundering of hooves, recognized the danger instantly. If the herd hit that canyon fence, they would panic and crush themselves against the rock walls. "We can't push them back against the wind," Jesse Eli shouted, his voice raw. "They're already too far gone." He made a sudden, desperate decision, a maneuver he had only practiced in theory with his old cavalry unit. It was the highest-risk gamble a rancher could make. 3 beans. "Jesse, get the remaining kerosene and torches. We are lighting a backfire. We burn the far bank opposite the canyon mouth. We draw a line of fire, controlled and fierce, to force them to turn before they hit the choke point." The plan was insane. Starting a controlled burn in gale-force winds near their own perimeter was an act of extreme desperation. If the wind shifted, the fire would consume the entire ranch. But if they did nothing, the herd was lost anyway. Meanwhile, Eleanor was already in command of the field commissary. She couldn't fight the fire or rope the steers, but she could manage the humans who were doing the fighting. The kitchen bell, now serving as a general alarm and signal post, clanged furiously. Eleanor organized the few remaining men and Hattie into a rapid deployment rescue and supply line. She distributed the last of the heavy, hot coffee, laced with extra sugar for immediate energy and to combat hypothermia. She handed out wet bandanas to shield lungs against the coming smoke and dust. "Water is the only thing that matters now," Eleanor commanded, her face grim. "3 beans. Take the sugar. Eli needs to keep his wits. Anyone injured comes to the barn door for treatment, no exceptions. The bell is our rally point." The battle intensified near the canyon entrance. Eli, Jesse, and 2 hands were struggling to ignite the dry, brittle scrub on the opposite side of the canyon mouth, racing against the approaching herd. It was here that the conflict shifted from nature versus man to man versus evil. Jesse, securing a flank, stumbled across 2 figures, Pike's men, including the foreman. Denton feverishly working to tighten the wire fence at the canyon mouth. They were closing the trap. "Get away from that fence," Jesse yelled, drawing a worn knife. The confrontation turned instantly into a chaotic brawl in the swirling dust and snow. Jesse, young but tenacious, managed to knock one man down, but Denton overpowered him, slamming him against the rock face. Eleanor, delivering a kettle of hot water to the fire crew, saw the struggle. She dropped the kettle, grabbed the nearest, heaviest implement, the fire shovel she used for clearing the stove's ash, and charged. She reached the fight just as Denton raised his fist to strike Jesse. Eleanor swung the shovel, connecting with a loud clang against the man's heavy leather boot. "This tool is for turning food. Mister!" Denton Eleanor yelled, her eyes blazing with fury. "But I can certainly use it to turn your head if you don't step away from that boy. I can turn beans, and I can turn a bad day into a worse day for you." The sheer audacity of the attack, delivered by a woman holding a soot-covered shovel, momentarily stunned Denton. The distraction was enough for Jesse to scramble free. Just then, a voice cut through the wind cold, official and utterly unwelcome. Sheriff Voss rode in, his face exposed and triumphant in the flickering light of the initial backfire. He held the official Denver extradition writ in his gloved hand, the paper fluttering wildly. "Stop this action. McCord, you are engaging in dangerous, illegal fire setting, and Eleanor Vance, under the authority of the law, you are under arrest for flight and arson." Eli, torch in hand, stood between Voss and Eleanor. The flames were licking the tinder-dry grass, growing quickly into a controlled, spreading line. "You arrest her after she saves the ranch." "Voss," Eli growled, his face covered in soot and sweat. "She just pulled a man from a burning barn 2 nights ago, and she is coordinating the defense now. You try to arrest her while she is saving lives and property." Voss drew his revolver, the metallic click loud and chilling over the wind. "You are obstructing justice. McCord, step aside. The law has caught up to the fugitive." It was the final, definitive moment of confrontation. But as Voss aimed his pistol, the carefully constructed counterplan that Eli and Eleanor had prepared over the last week began to unfold. From the darkness behind Voss, Hattie Rose appeared, riding the mule and leading a small, determined cluster of Dry Creek residents, the livery owner, the blacksmith, and the couple who ran the general store. They had followed the smoke and the clamor of the wind, witnessing the desperate fight. Hattie was holding a glass vial, clearly containing the unnatural purple dye. Sheriff Voss Hattie's voice was surprisingly strong. "I have evidence here. This dye matches the poison found in the stream poison that was used to deliberately sabotage Sweetwater's water supply. We have the town's own records showing Bartholomew Pike purchased enough of this industrial coloring to poison the whole county." Simultaneously, Jesse, recovering from the struggle, pulled out the crumpled receipt he had risked his life to obtain the invoice showing Pike's purchase of the volatile oil used to accelerate the hay barn fire. "Pike did this, not the cook," Jesse shouted, holding the paper high, the wind whipping the edges. "They tried to ruin Sweetwater so Pike could buy the water cheap." The townspeople, standing in the stinging cold, watched the sheriff holding his gun on Eli, standing next to the woman who was clearly the heart of the ranch's desperate defense. They saw the proof of deliberate sabotage, the poisoned water, the professional fire, all pointing directly at Pike and his corrupt ally. The sheriff? The attention shifted entirely from Eleanor's vague, distant Denver crime to Voss's blatant, immediate corruption. But the danger was not over. The backfire, now fully ablaze, was successfully turning the herd, forcing the bewildered cattle to curve away from the canyon choke point. Eli and the hands were scrambling across the treacherous, uneven ground near the cliff edge, maintaining the line of controlled flame. A loose slab of rock, weakened by the dry summer and the sudden cold, gave way beneath Eli's boot. He slipped, falling toward the precipice overlooking the narrow gorge, his hand flailing for purchase. Eleanor was closest, reacting with the same lightning-fast instinct that had saved Jesse. She threw herself onto the ground, seizing Eli's wrist in a vice-like grip. The heat from the controlled fire on the opposite bank threw a bright, savage light onto her face and into her eyes that were wide with terror, but absolutely committed. Eli, dangling precariously, shouted a single word above the gale. "Trust me." "I trust you," Eleanor responded fiercely, locking her grip onto the rough fabric of his cuff, her own scarred wrist taking the entire weight of his body. "Trust me." She grabbed a length of coiled rope he was carrying and, with a desperate, two-handed effort, managed to secure it around a sturdy, exposed root. They were locked together, a moment of absolute mutual dependence and commitment. They used the tension of the rope, working together against the wind, to haul Eli back up to safety, his feet finally finding purchase on solid ground. It was the physical culmination of their relationship, falling and standing together, relying on unstated faith. With Eli safely back, the momentum shifted decisively. The backfire, successfully established, roared its success, acting as a fiery wall that safely diverted the bulk of the herd back toward the open, secured grazing lands. Pike's trap had failed. Voss, seeing the townsfolk holding the evidence and realizing his authority had evaporated, looked panicked. As he wavered, Hattie rose and the blacksmith moved in swiftly. The blacksmith seized Voss's pistol, wrenching it free, while Hattie calmly confiscated the Denver writ. The momentum of justice was sudden and powerful. The cowhands, victorious against the fire, converged. Pike, who had been watching from the shadows, saw his plot collapse, mounted his horse, and tried to flee the scene, but his massive gelding, unnerved by the fire and the slush of early snow, slipped in a patch of muddy trail near the canyon's base. Pike was thrown and quickly captured by Three Beans and Jesse, trussed up like a holiday roast. The climax was over. The great danger had passed. A thin, fragile layer of snow was now dusting the ground, settling on the cooling ash. The remaining men gathered around the small, field kitchen fire Eleanor had quickly built, their faces streaked with soot and relief. Eli walked toward Eleanor through the swirling vapor and smoke, his chest heaving, his eyes stinging from the dust and the sudden emotion. He didn't speak. Words were utterly inadequate. He simply pulled her into a tight, secure embrace, crushing her against his heavy coat. Eleanor clung to him, feeling the solid, living reality of his body against hers, hearing the steady rhythm of his heart. The air smelled of burnt grass, wet earth, and salvation. In the midst of the smoke and the gentle snowfall, they stood together, two survivors who had risked everything and won. The flames were dying down, but the heat between them was steady and absolute. They were safe. They had each other. The morning after the white wind was a day of reckoning, cold and quiet. The town council meeting, originally intended as a rubber stamp for the sheriff's extradition request, turned into an impromptu tribunal held in the general store, the only place large enough to hold the gathered townsfolk. Pike, mud-splattered and furious, and Voss, pale and sweating, stood accused. Not the fugitive cook, Eli McCord, his face still smudged with soot, presented the physical evidence with the calm authority of a man whose livelihood had just been salvaged by fire, and guts the purple dye in the vial that matched the purchase receipt, the detailed notes on the specific tracks left by Pike's foreman, and the testimony regarding the hay barn arson. The evidence was overwhelming and incontrovertible. The town council, seeing their financial dependence on Pike suddenly balanced by their moral outrage over the water poisoning and the destruction of the ranch that fed them, quickly found their courage. Voss was formally stripped of his badge and his office, charged with conspiracy and obstruction of justice. Pike was arrested, charged with malicious destruction of property, water sabotage, and collusion. A territorial law agent, who had arrived on the stagecoach that very morning, recorded the entire proceedings, ensuring the charges would stick. With the local threats neutralized, the council turned to the matter of Eleanor. The old Denver charges were still technically valid. "We have the writ for Eleanor Vance, alias Wynne," stated Mr. Hastings, the dry goods store owner and reluctant council chairman. "We must address the issue of the arson charge." Eleanor stood quietly. Eli had secured legal counsel from the territorial agent, but it was Hattie Rose who intervened first. "The sheriff was the one harassing her, not the other way around," Hattie declared. "Standing beside Eleanor, she saved Jesse's life. She saved the herd, and she proved the local lawman was corrupt. Her character speaks for itself." The territorial agent stepped forward. "We have received a supplementary letter from Denver. It seems the former deputy fire marshal, the one pursuing Miss Wynne, has himself been implicated in unrelated corruption. Furthermore, a stagecoach driver who carried Miss Wynne away from Denver a year ago has come forward, claiming he saw a man matching the former deputy's description near the warehouse fire just before the blaze began." The agent summarized the findings. The original case against Eleanor was fatally flawed, built on the false testimony of a now disgraced official and countered by a credible new witness. The official ruling was declared. The extradition request was denied. Eleanor Vance was officially cleared of the Denver charges, or at least the charges were suspended indefinitely. Her character validated by the community she had just saved. Her alias was no longer a shield. It was a memorial to a past she had survived. The work of recovery began immediately. Sweetwater Ranch was battered but not broken. In the days that followed, the entire crew worked to rebuild the hay shed and secure the water basins. The spirit of the work was different now. It was infused with camaraderie and purpose, no longer shadowed by the threat of Pike. Eleanor, recovering from her own exhaustion, directed the construction of a new, sturdier water collector and the rebuilding of the kitchen storage, lost in the chaotic hours of the fire. She also started an impromptu apprenticeship program. Several young women from Dry Creek, mostly daughters of store owners and laborers who usually only handled laundry, came to the ranch. They were drawn by Eleanor's reputation for skill and her fierce independence. Eleanor taught them not just to cook, but to manage how to balance ledgers, how to store meat for preservation, and how to command a kitchen with quiet authority. She was, quite unintentionally, creating a new generation of capable, self-sufficient women in the territory, teaching them the language of power through food. The kitchen, once again, became the center of warm, enduring humor. Three Beans, still nursing a residual cough from the smoke inhalation, sat near the stove one afternoon, watching Eleanor prepare a massive pot of beans, a dish he now approached with mock solemnity. "Miss Vance," he started, coughing lightly for effect, "I see you are still only using one variety of bean in that pot. Pinto, plain pinto. Where is the black bean for spirit and the lima bean for hope?" As I requested. Eleanor stirred the pot, a deep, satisfied smile on her face. "Owen, listen to me closely. A man only needs one kind of bean when the cook is doing her job. You wanted 3 beans for the variety. I say 1 bean is enough if you add enough affection and enough fire to the pot. If the cook is in love, 3 kinds of beans is just a noisy distraction." The crew, overhearing the sly double meaning, hooted and laughed, realizing the subtle shift in the relationship between the boss and the cook. 3 Beans shrugged, defeated but content. All right. When you are the cook, one bean is a miracle. Just don't give me a lima bean. When you get married, a man needs to be nourished, not hopeful. Eli McCord formalized Eleanor's role and acknowledged her contribution in a way that truly mattered to the working men. When the meager profits from the salvaged season were tallied, Eli shared a portion of the revenue with his crew, but he presented Eleanor with a special gift. He used the new, clean wood harvested from the rebuilding effort to construct a sturdy, permanent sign above the kitchen door. He had carefully hand-carved the lettering, Eleanor's Galley. He presented her with a newly forged iron key, heavier than the old brass one, and handed it to her. "This is the key to the main house kitchen. Eleanor," Eli said, his voice husky with pride. "No more back door, no more storage key. This is the key to the house. And your name is on the outside. You saved the harvest, you secured the water, and you fought off the worst of the law. This galley is yours." It was the full, public acknowledgement of her status as an equal partner in the ranch's survival, a testament to her courage. Eleanor continued to treat Eli's minor burn wounds, which were healing slowly. The ritual was quiet and deeply intimate, a brief, silent sanctuary carved out of the daily labor. One evening, as she was rewrapping the bandage around his forearm, she traced the edge of the reddish scar tissue. "It is a handsome scar, Eli," she murmured, her voice soft. Eli looked down at her, his eyes warm and steady. "It is a handsome scar because you are the one touching it." It was a profound exchange, small words carrying the weight of their massive, shared journey. The scars of the past, both physical and emotional, were becoming marks of shared survival and commitment. The community, too, underwent a quiet transformation. Mrs. Morrison, the woman who had criticized Eleanor's ambition, approached her in town after the trial. "Miss Vance, I owe you an apology." "Mrs." Morrison said stiffly, her eyes downcast. "I misjudged you. You have more character than any of us city folk here. You saved this town." That week, the church held a community celebration for the successful end of the drought threat. The centerpiece of the feast was Eleanor's slow-cooked, rich beef stew, a symbol of the food that had saved them. The shared meal helped melt away the last vestiges of suspicion and prejudice. Dry Creek had learned that true value lay in capability and kindness, not in wealth or a long, established family name. Eleanor performed one final ritual to close the door on her past. She took the last remaining scraps of the old Denver newspaper, the one she hadn't burned earlier, and walked out to a small patch of ground near the kitchen where she was trying to grow a few fragile herbs. She ignited the papers, watching the fugitive's alias and the false accusation turn into a plume of white smoke. She then scattered the ash over the dry soil. "Ashes feed the soil," she whispered, repeating the mantra she had heard so many times. It was a symbolic act of rebirth, using the remnants of her dark past to nourish the hope of her future at Sweetwater. The shadow was lifted. She was free, physically and spiritually, ready to build her life on solid ground. The dust of the legal battle had settled, and Sweetwater was beginning the slow, steady process of healing. Yet, even as Eleanor felt secure in her new life, a final connection to her old one arrived, a quiet twist of human kindness that felt more impactful than any courtroom victory. The territorial agent, before leaving Dry Creek, had ensured that the letters Eleanor had left behind in Denver were finally forwarded. One afternoon, the mail rider handed Eleanor a thick, neatly tied packet. It was a long overdue letter from her mother. Eleanor, who had expected condemnation or bitter disappointment for having run away and caused such worry, carefully broke the seal. Her mother's handwriting was familiar and strong. The letter contained no anger, only a deep, abiding worry, and an understanding of the impossible position Eleanor had been forced into. The letter also contained a gift, a small, hand-drawn illustration of an apple and a faded, brittle piece of paper containing the family's most treasured legacy, the secret. Meticulous recipe for their spiced fruit preserves and their original sourdough starter mix. a formula passed down through 3 generations of Wynn women who had run small bakeries back east. Tucked into the envelope was a final, touching relic, a pair of old, heavy iron bread tongs, blackened by years of fire, worn smooth by her grandmother's hands. It was a family pedigree of scent, an inheritance rooted in the honest craft of the kitchen. Her mother wasn't cutting her off. She was passing the fire. Eleanor wept only a little. Holding the tongs, her roots were not cut. They had simply traveled. The danger from Pike and Voss had been neutralized, but malice often lingers in the form of desperate, cornered men. One night, long after the moon had set, Eleanor was doing a final check of the kitchen fire, her custom now. She heard a faint, furtive noise near the new water storage cistern they had built. She moved quickly and silently, grabbing the heavy, short-handled cast-iron skillet the one Three Beans had once feared. She crept outside just in time to see a shadowy figure, one of Pike's low-level thugs who had evaded capture, attempting to pry a pipe loose from the cistern, aiming to drain their precious collected water back into the dry ground. The man saw her too late. Eleanor didn't hesitate. She lifted the skillet and, with a ferocious determination born of protecting her home, slammed it against the wooden cistern housing near the man's head. The clang was deafening, a massive, echoing sound in the still night air. Simultaneously, she lifted the great brass dinner bell that sat beside the back door and pulled the rope, ringing the fire alarm 3 long, frantic peals. The sound instantly galvanized the ranch. The men, disciplined by weeks of fighting the Blue Norther, sprang awake. Eli, Jesse, and Three Beans charged out of the bunkhouse, rifles in hand, followed by Hattie Rose, clutching a rolling pin. The thug, startled and momentarily disoriented by the noise, made a run for it, but the unified response was too fast. Jesse and Three Beans cut him off, and within minutes, the last remnant of Pike's threat was caught and trussed. Eleanor stood over the man, skillet in hand, her breathing ragged, but her eyes steady. The successful defense was a testament to the community's new discipline and her unyielding vigilance. The threat was not a random occurrence. It was a final test of their resolve. And they had passed. With the immediate dangers settled, Eli and Eleanor stole a moment of quiet solitude. They climbed the familiar, winding path up to a high, exposed ridge of rock that overlooked the entire Sweetwater stream bed. The night was clear. The stars spread out like spilled diamond dust across the immense black canopy. Eli was visibly nervous, a strange sight for a man who had faced stampedes and fire without flinching. He shuffled his feet on the gravel, looking down at the creek below, where the sound of the gently flowing water was a lullaby of peace. "Eleanor," he started, his voice rougher than usual. "I'm no good with pretty words. Never was. I'm good at building fences. Strong, straight lines that keep the good in and the danger out." Eleanor smiled, leaning her head on his shoulder. "A strong fence is what holds a home together." "Eli, it's the most beautiful word I know." Eli nodded, finding courage in her simple declaration. He pulled a small, oil-stained tin box wrapped tightly in soft canvas from his coat pocket. He opened the box, revealing a crude but perfectly beautiful silver band. The ring was not the sleek, polished jewelry of the East. It was rough-hewn, clearly hand-forged, bearing the hammer marks of its creation. It was the work of the town blacksmith, heated and shaped with Hattie's help. Engraved roughly into the surface of the silver were 2 words, "Sweet and Heat." It was a simple, profound play on the ranch's name, Sweetwater, and Eli's own private observation about the inner fire that defined Eleanor. Eli took her hand, his large thumb resting on the scar that had once been the symbol of her imprisonment. "I choose you, Eleanor, every morning and every night," Eli said, his voice dropping to a low, powerful register. "Not because of the good food, but because of the person who cooks it. Where you are, that is home. I want the rest of my life to be spent building a strong fence around you and this ranch. Will you marry me?" Eleanor Wynne. Eleanor's eyes glistened in the starlight. There was no hesitation. This was the true place to belong, found not in a fancy city, but in the heart of a good man on a harsh piece of land. "Yes, Eli McCord," she whispered. 1,000 times, yes. But Eleanor, ever the witty spirit, had to have the final, loving jab. She slipped the unique, heavy ring onto her finger, watching the silver gleam. "The ring is handsome," she teased, tilting her head. "But does this agreement also mean you will finally start washing the dishes?" Eli grinned, the kind of open, joyous smile that rarely crossed his weathered face. "If I get a kiss after every clean basin, I'll wash them until my hands turn to leather." Deal made. She finalized. Negotiation complete. The spontaneous proposal had not gone entirely unnoticed. Below the ridge, hidden near the bunkhouse, Hattie, Jessie, and the entire kitchen crew, 3 beans included, had been waiting, keeping a nervous watch. When they heard Eleanor's definitive yes, they erupted in cheers and whoops. Someone, likely 3 beans, fired a small, harmless charge of popcorn kernels into the air, creating a brief, sparkling shower of white flakes that danced under the moonlight, mimicking a cascade of paper confetti. The stars, immense and distant, seemed to join in the celebration, raining down their quiet light. The community had witnessed the promise. They walked back down to the ranch, their hands entwined. The kitchen fire was banked down to a peaceful glow. Inside, the warmth was thick and comforting, smelling of old spices and new promises. They sat together on the wooden bench, sipping Hattie's powerful mint tea, their shadows long and merged on the wall. The world outside the kitchen was the wilderness, full of wind and threats, but inside, they were whole. Eli watched the flickering oil lamp. Eleanor rested her head on his shoulder, his arm secured around her. They didn't speak again. The light of the lamp slowly guttered and went out, plunging the kitchen into soft darkness. The only sounds were the gentle breathing of 2 people whose hearts finally beat in unison, and the quiet sound of the wind touching the outer walls, a silence that held the entirety of their shared future. The season turned slowly, deliberately, into spring. Snowmelt fed the parched earth, and the plains of Sweetwater bloomed with a tentative green. The long, weary battle against drought and greed was over, replaced by the steady rhythm of growth and rebuilding. The ranch flourished. The rebuilt cisterns and new settling basins were full of clear water, guarded diligently. The herd, though smaller than before, was healthy, grazing contentedly on the fresh grass. Sweetwater Ranch, resilient and principled, was doing better than ever. The McCords had even hired new hands, including several young women from Dry Creek, apprentices Eleanor had taken under her wing to work in the expanded kitchen and manage the supply ledgers. Justice, though often slow, had been served with satisfying thoroughness. Bartholomew Pike faced territorial charges. The evidence of arson, water contamination, and business sabotage led to a heavy fine and the forfeiture of a significant portion of his unlawfully acquired lands, crippling his monopoly. Sheriff Voss had packed his bags in the dead of night and vanished from the territory, leaving the town without the shadow of his corrupt stick. Dry Creek held a quiet, dignified election, installing the blacksmith, a man of simple honesty and firm hand, as the new sheriff. The law, built from the bottom up, was stronger and more trustworthy than before. Eleanor and Eli, now formally betrothed, had poured their shared energy into realizing Eleanor's long-standing dream, not in a distant city, but right where they had fought for it. They converted a long, covered section of the main bunkhouse porch into a simple, beautiful eatery. It was called, simply, Galley at Sweetwater. The space was furnished with a long, sturdy, wooden communal table, scrubbed clean and covered with cheerful checkered linen. A large chalkboard listed the daily specials, always fresh, always hearty, and often involving Eleanor's famed sourdough. Townsfolk, travelers, and even men from rival ranches began lining up. eager for the legendary cooking and the honest, convivial atmosphere. Eleanor was no longer merely a cook. She was the proprietor of the most popular establishment in the valley. The characters, forged in fire and water, had completed their transformation. Eleanor Wynne, the woman who arrived under an assumed name, running from a false charge and the ghost of a scar, was now the secure matriarch of Sweetwater. She had transformed from a fugitive into the anchor of a community, confident in her skills, having finally forgiven her past by using the lessons of fire for good. She no longer sought a place to hide, but a place to lead, empowering other women through the dignity of labor. Eli McCord, the taciturn former cavalryman, had learned to open his heart and share his burden. He was no longer the lone man struggling to hold the ranch together. He had learned to trust absolutely, to delegate authority to those who earned it, and, most importantly, to articulate his deep love and admiration for the woman who saved his home. The supporting pillars, Hattie Rose, Jesse Boone, and Owen Threebeans remained the steadfast core. Hattie, sharp and insightful, was Eleanor's most trusted counsel. Jesse, now a capable young cowhand, was utterly loyal. Threebeans was the perennial source of laughter and pragmatic observation, the constant witness to the ranch's triumphs. The profound symbols of their story stood fully realized in the busy, comforting kitchen. The massive, black cast-iron skillet, once used to defend Jesse and later to warn off the saboteur, hung proudly near the stove, heavy, durable, and reliable. Like their commitment to one another, the old, worn iron bread tongs, a gift from Eleanor's mother, were used daily, a tangible connection to a generational legacy of fire and sustenance, and the clear, rushing Sweetwater Creek, flowing freely and fully into the new cistern, represented the life and hope they had fought so hard to secure. The central message of their story echoed in the sounds of the busy kitchen: true, enduring love is not a miracle handed down from the heavens, but a commitment forged in shared labor, sacrifice, and mutual respect. Justice, though often delayed by corruption, will eventually prevail when a community finds the courage to stand up for decency. And a woman is not merely assigned to the kitchen. She can lead from the kitchen, sustaining life, building homes, and changing the moral fiber of the society around her. Dry Creek, once defined by its narrow prejudices, learned that true value lay not in power or lineage, but in competence, integrity, and simple, profound kindness. Now, the children of the town came to Eleanor's galley, learning not just to bake biscuits, but to respect the water and the fire that made life possible. The laughter was constant, often revolving around Threebeans' enduring obsession with legumes. Miss Eleanor, Threebeans declared one busy morning, holding up a plate. Since you and the boss are getting married next month, I have finally reduced my bean intake down to 2 varieties. I figured, since you already have the fire and sweetness of love, I only need 2 more things in my stew. Eleanor, placing a massive wedding cake order on her planning board, winked at him. Owen, listen to me, and listen well. When I marry Eli McCord, you are only allowed one kind of bean in your plate, the kind I tell you to eat. Anything else is anarchy. The entire communal table roared with laughter, a joyous affirmation of their hard-won peace, as the sun began to set, bathing the plains in a deep amber honey. Eleanor and Eli stood together on the porch of the galley, watching the windmill turn slowly in the evening breeze. The air was fragrant with baking sourdough and new sage. Eli leaned down, his voice low and private, a perfect echo of the compliment he had given her in the desperate midpoint of their journey. The ranch hired you to cook, but only I know your heat could burn sweeter than any fire. Eleanor turned in his arms, her eyes shining with the light of 1,000 fires, both past and future. I kept the fire, and we built the home, she replied simply, resting her head against his shoulder. The windmill continued its slow, faithful rotation. The scent of baked goodness drifted into the open air, a promise of warmth and abundance. The distant herd was a quiet, dark presence on the horizon. The future would undoubtedly be difficult. This was the West. After all, but two people now knew exactly how to light the fire and keep the water flowing. They had everything they needed. Thank you for listening to Eleanor and Eli's story. Let us know where you are listening from in the comments so we can all connect and share our thoughts on the frontier life. Please subscribe to Wild West Tales, like the video, and support us by pressing the hype button so more people can discover this love story.